All right, Preeti ji, we can start.
Andy, thank you. Good evening and welcome to our third session this month. We have a conversation for you this evening between award-winning author and journalist Taran N, who's here with us, and her very first book, which is what we're going to talk about, Shadow City. Here it is, if you can see it. Has won the Tata Literature Live First Book Award, and it's also won the Stanford, sorry, I'm not getting the second name, Stanford Dolman Travel Book Award. And she is joining us here from Aligarh. Talking to her this evening is Padmini Mongia, Professor of English at Franklin and Marshall College in the US. It's very early for her, so thank you both of you for being here. Padmini is also a writer. She has done academic books, but what is even more fascinating is that she writes fabulous stories for young readers, for children. Taran's first book, as I said, Shadow City, which I just showed you. And by the way, I must say that each one of you must get down to Amazon right away as soon as we finish the session and order a copy for yourself. This book is about the city of Kabul and her discovery of it through innumerable walks, through streets and homes and graveyards and cinemas and bookshops and hills and, you know, wanderings and more wanderings, where she shows us the new city, the new poppy palaces. She shows us bombed out, destroyed old houses, and she offers us a unique, poignant, and very personal view of the city. Taran, of course, has been told when she lands there that she must never walk in the city. And that is advice that she promptly ignores. And I'm really glad, thank God, that she did that, because it gives us a really fascinating look into the city. And from that first visit in 2006, as she journeys there from her home in India, from Aligarh, over the next 8 years, we see Kabul transforming, changing, destroyed, rebuilt again and again. And there's an overwhelming sadness for a people, for a culture, a land which seems to be under siege and which seems to be constantly being battered and torn by decades of conflict and horrific violence. And yet, when I look back at my own mind space, and when I think of Kabul and Afghanistan, I see actually in my mind's eye a beautiful land of mountains, of tall, good-looking people who are proud, fearless, honorable. I think of fabulous fruits, of warm breads and kebabs, of gardens and water, of a culture that prizes poetry and music. And I'm glad that Taran also shows us this through her lens. For as she says somewhere in another interview that I'd read, there is joy and happiness and beauty amidst the violence and unrelenting conflict. And this is what we want to listen to, both sides of the city called Kabul. So I'm going to hand the conversation over to Padmini over here to take this forward. And looking forward to this wonderful tour of Kabul. Thank you both again.
Thank you, Preeti, and welcome, Taran. We're really looking forward to our conversation today. So as we decided you'd start with a reading because most people in the audience have not yet read your book, something I hope they're soon going to change. So should we just start there and then we can, after they've got a little flavor, then we can get into the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll start by saying thank you very much to Preeti ji and to Madha House for inviting me for the session. And Padmini, thank you for reading the book so carefully and for doing the session. And it's really special. It's a really special part of having a book out in the world that I didn't quite anticipate while I was writing it, of having readers join their stories to the ones that I've written. Like Preeti's beautiful, idea that she shared about what she thought Kabul is. And I'm so grateful to each and every person who reads this book, who writes or who shares whatever they feel after reading these pages. It's really special. And I hadn't really thought of this part of the process when I was writing. So it's really like an extra gift. I'll start by reading just a small bit from the first chapter, which is called Returns. I'm sharing this, as you said, because in case people haven't read the book, this is where stories begin, and this is how stories begin in Kabul. So I thought this might be a good way to get started talking about the story of Kabul. Stories in Kabul begin with the phrase, Yeki Boot, Yeki Naboot. There was one, there was no one. The phrase corresponds to the once upon a time of fairy tales elsewhere. Whichever way you choose to read this expression, it is a good place to begin the story of Kabul, a city that was and never was. Or to use the trick of fables, there it is not. The story of Kabul begins with bridges, roads appearing on water. In one legend about its origin, it appeared as a magic island in the middle of a large lake. To reach the island, a king built a bridge or a pull made of straw or ka. The combination of the two words that created this bridge, ka and pull, gave the city he made on this magic isle its name. Kabul is an island, or so it appears to the outsider standing on one of its nondescript pothole streets. It deceives you with its high walls streaked with brown mud, punctuated by steel-topped gates. It hides behind the fine mist of dust that hangs over its streets and homes, so that the city appears as though from the other side of a soft curtain, like a mirage, a place that is both near and far away. But walk through the small opening in an entrance gate and everything changes. You enter lush gardens and beautiful homes. Their rooms filled with books, carpets, photographs, and music. In the older quarters of the city, the flat mud roofs of tightly packed homes form a different kind of thoroughfare, an elevated path across secluded spaces that is protected from the public gaze. Elsewhere, there appear landscapes of homes clinging to the hills, their windows half reflecting the sky, half revealing glimpses of life in the rooms within. The city appears with a shift in perspective. As a child, I was fascinated by a tiny kaleidoscope my father bought me. It was a plastic tube with a transparent cap at the end, filled with pieces of broken bangles, colored glass of different sizes. I was riveted by this transformation of everyday objects into the fragments of a magical landscape. And I was drawn to how a simple shift of my wrist or even of my eye would make the pieces rearrange themselves into a new picture. Walking in Kabul is like looking through the kaleidoscope. Fragments fall into place, the familiar appears new. There it is not. Kabul appears where you don't expect to see it. I'll stop there and we can maybe talk about this another later.
Thank you. It's one of the things that I did want us to talk about, but we'll get to it maybe later after people have again a fuller sense of the book. So the place I'm going to start is if you could describe for us a little bit about your, in a way, two slightly different agendas. So you start out going to Kabul as a journalist, you have work to do there, right? And then in the process of doing that between 2006 and 2014, you also obviously start writing and making notes and discovering a city in a way a little bit different from the way a journalist would discover it. So perhaps you could share with us a little bit about your, I don't know if discontent is quite the right word, but the limitations that you felt you experienced as a journalist that led you then to a different kind of discovery of Kabul.
Yeah, that's a great question, Padmini. I actually went, I am a journalist, and that was, of course, a part of the work I was doing there. But what actually took me to Kabul for the first time was to work in training, to work with Afghan media producers in a small TV and radio channel. And I think that was so important. The way I engaged with Kabul almost from the very first day was through these people ordinary Afghans living and working in the city. And as I've written in the book, they were the ones who opened so many doors and shared so many stories to me. And I feel that quality of intimacy and access was what really hooked me and my husband. Like, we both just kept going back as often as we could from 2006 to 13, actually a year before the ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force Coalition, was to formally end its combat operations. So we saw the arc, which was essentially 5 years after the Taliban government had been removed. And just a year before, at that time, it seemed like the end of, or the closing of that arc, which had begun in 2001. Of course, it's been far longer, and now we have a different date in September where the US is going to be withdrawing its forces, and now it seems like the end of another era. But at that time, in 2013, it felt like we had, in hindsight, seen this cycle of transformation in Kabul. And I agree with you that it was a different way of seeing the city than if I had been simply there as a journalist, or if I had been passing through, on a different kind of shorter assignment. But because I was living and working and listening to all these people, I think that was really my entry point into the relationship with Kabul that I developed. And that could let me write about. Then, of course, that fed into the way I wrote about it, which was, as a journalist, I was taking notes. I was, of course, publishing in India and internationally. But I was increasingly, the longer I spent in the city, the more I felt that, okay, I might be writing the facts of this place, and I'm writing the news. But and even though I wasn't writing sort of hard news, I wasn't covering, the news cycle. Even when I was writing feature stories, or when I was writing longer stories which are sort of, news peg, but they give you a little more space to talk about issues, I felt that I was really missing what I really loved about Kabul, or what made it such a unique place. And there was the sense that I want to address all of that. So if it was like a film, I felt like I was leaving all the good bits on the cutting floor, like that was the stuff that was getting edited out. So that's how I started experimenting, writing longer pieces, writing somewhat different pieces. And that's also where I think the idea of a book kind of accumulated, in that sense of wanting to communicate the feeling of being in that place at that time.
Okay. There are two other sort of dimensions of your encounter with Kabul that I think are really compelling. And one of them has to do with origin. So the fact that you're a Khan and descended many, generations ago, but still it's a kind of a homecoming in a strange way. And so that would be an interesting thing to talk about. And then, of course, it would be good for everybody to be introduced to Baba, who is such an important interlocutor in your exploration. So maybe you could talk about both of those, and that will give people, I think, a good kind of context for the way in which you approach the city.
Yeah, like you said, these were the two lenses I took with me when I went the first time, and I wasn't, it's embarrassing now how ignorant I was about the city, that I went to with so much enthusiasm. I was really, really drawn to it, but in terms of knowing really history, geography, I wasn't super well informed, I would say. But my paternal family is, as you say, we have Pashtun descent, and we had this sort of story that we all told ourselves that our ancestry was linked to that part of the world. And if you read the book, you'll see that this was actually a myth. And but it was interesting in that it gave me a frame to arrive in the city, which was a frame of excitement. I went there very, very happy to be going, which was, now I see it was different from the feeling of fear or anxiety, or just the sense that I was going into a war zone. So I'm grateful for that emotion, because I think it helped me connect with Kabul in a different way on my arrival. And the other part of this was my maternal grandfather, Baba, who had never been to Kabul, and he had no sort of link to it in ancestral terms either, but he knew it really well through his relationship with books, with reading, with the cultural continuum of this entire region. And he would describe aspects of the city to me that even when I was there, would be obscured. Of course, partly because of my own limitations, and partly because so much of what is evident in Kabul is the immediate last 3 decades and the longer cultural heritage or the longer cultural texture of that city can very easily get buried behind the tapestry of war that has been now for 4 decades has defined the city. So I found from Baba the means to get under the skin of Kabul. And when I would come back from my time there and we would discuss what I had seen or what I had read, and then he would tell me things that he knew about the city or its streets or its poets or its history or who the saints who were buried there or the writers who had passed through. And I would be okay, well, the next time I go I have to check this out, and that then informed how I saw Kabul. And I think this was again a really, really precious gift that my grandfather gave me, was the ability to pare beyond the obvious and to see the city as it's been for centuries, and to see that it has been a city for centuries. I think just that beginning was a really valuable step to get from.
Yeah, and I think I found that to be one of the most compelling sort of access points in your exploring Kabul, because for me, and I shared some of these thoughts with you, for me, what really struck me was that for somebody like Baba and for somebody from his generation, Kabul was part of the kind of texture of his linguistic, literary background, right? Whereas for our generation, my generation, you're a younger generation, Kabul it's a different place. It's not a place that we know in the same way as somebody 50 years older, yeah? And so amongst the ways in which I responded to your book was with an awareness of how the places west of us, in my case, it was Pakistan, and I mean, true for many of the people here, that became forbidden places, but there were places that we couldn't go to for a whole host of reasons. And so what Baba kind of gives you access to, in a way, is a past through his present, but that takes you back to a time when there was connectivity, right? Whether it was linguistic or literary. And you talk a lot about your literary influences. So you talk, for instance, about Persian poetry, again, maybe through Baba, right? Or you're turning to the Babarnama or the Tagore. And it would be really interesting to know a little bit more about your literary influences, if you could share some of those at this point.
Sure, yeah. I mean, to your point about the relationship, the difference in the texture of relationships, I think that's so important. And I'm so glad you caught on to that, because that was a very central part of the process of writing the book for me, was the sense that I was on ground that used to be very familiar. There used to be a lot of traffic here. Right. I wasn't discovering anything new. This was really dense terrain, and I mean, partly I'm sure it's partly me, partly my limitations in terms of the reading, education, and interest. But with all that, like you say, it's a connection that's become more and more ephemeral over the years. And I think what really concretized that for me was the way in which people would always ask when I would return from Kabul, or when it would come up in conversation that I would be working there. They would always say like, "Oh, Kabul what is it like there?" And in that tone of like the there, it felt like it was a city that was beyond their experience, beyond their imagination. But what I was getting from Baba was, even though he had never been there, it was a city he could very easily imagine and conceptualize and relate to. So this was obviously, and even in Kabul, people I spoke to would tell me with this sense of urgency, this sense of like connection in their voices, that that there's a lot of, we have a lot in common with Indian culture. I would hear this often, and they always told me like something that I had forgotten, I being an Indian had forgotten, but they remembered. So there was this sense I always got that yes, this isn't new. This is all terrain that has really been quite really remarkably well worked on. But yeah, so, and I think in terms of my literary influences, so much of the relationship is through books, is because of my grandfather. That was his primary frame of reference. He was most of his life framed by by writing and by text and poetry and theater. But also because when the house that I grew up here is, I grew up as part of this big joint family. And we never really got to buy books for ourselves. Like when I was young, I couldn't go to a bookshop and pick out the books I wanted to read. But there were these bookshelves, these almaris full of books. And they were all inherited books. I mean, some of them were my aunt and uncle's books, or books from the 1950s that were given to them as awards for good elocution or perfect attendance in their boarding school or something like that. C.G. Woodhouse and a lot of Georgette Hairs that my aunt used to read. So I would see their like maiden names, and by that time they were married. So I would see their maiden names scrawled in the fly leaves, and that would be like meeting someone who I knew, but you know, a slightly different version of my aunt in that book. So I think I was pretty omnivorous in my reading, and I read whatever I could find, and I really love the sense of serendipity in encountering books, because it was such a luxury to choose books. I mean, we would go to the book fair in Delhi once a year, and we were allowed to choose maybe a couple of books there. But there were so many books to read at home that, you know, my parents would just say, well, finish the ones you have right now. So I think that kind of shaped how I read a lot. I wouldn't say that the people I read are the people I love reading are the ones who most deeply influence my writing. But I feel that I was lucky to have a range of voices to draw from. So between Baba's library, when I would go to visit my maternal grandparents, his library, and between the books in my own home, in my maternal home, I found Persian books. I found Persian writers. I found Urdu writers. I found all the Russian fairy tales that were common when I was growing up, translations of these beautifully illustrated works that you could get very cheaply at that time. There were for Hindi books, there was a lot of poetry. There were the slightly more corny Urdu stories that my paternal grandmother liked to read. So I got a whole range of things. I think that was really valuable for me. And of course, later on, I developed my own taste in reading, but I would say that it's given me the ability to read, quite across tenors.
I'm thinking of those Russian fairy tales. I also remember buying them very cheaply at the book fairs. And now that I'm older and think about the place of books in the world, it was also obviously a kind of a tool, right? A propagandist tool. Yeah. But it's interesting, and they were very beautifully illustrated.
And they also broke the homogeneity, I think. It's of course they were a tool of propaganda, and the reason they were cheap was because you got really good Hindi and English and Urdu translations of these books as well, which obviously was because there was a reason for that. But it broke the homogeneity of our reading, I think, which was really, now I feel that was a valuable thing to have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to shift off to another really compelling way in which you approach Kabul, and that is the kind of overlaying that you do of Aligarh on Kabul in a way, right? And done by your experience of being a woman in a city or in two cities in which it is not comfortable or advisable to walk, yeah? And I think it would be lovely if you could read that little section out, if that's okay by you, about, walking in Aligarh, and then, is that all right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
So the part I'm reading is again from close to the beginning, and this is the frame for how walking kind of came to define the structure of the book, and why it meant so much to me to be able to write this book as a sort of a bipedal expedition into Kabul. I'll just read and then maybe we can explain if required. I have a complicated relationship with walking. This has a lot to do, I suspect, with having grown up in Aligarh, a city in northern India, where walking on the streets came with intense male scrutiny and the sense of being in a proscribed space. As a woman stepping out onto its thoroughfares, I needed a reason to place my body on the street. I learned to display a posture of work while walking and to erase any signs that may hint at my being out of pleasure for no reason at all, other than to walk. All this means that I see walking as a luxury, not something to be taken for granted. It is an act of autonomy and mobility I learned early to seize as a form of pleasure. I also grew adept at the allied skill of reading my terrain, looking out for signs that told me if it was open or off limits. Being told not to walk was another way in which Kabul felt familiar. To map the city, I drew on the same knowledge and intuition that had helped me navigate the streets of my hometown, which is why, unlike the maps of guidebooks that seek to make checklists and establish authority, the routes I took were wandering and idiosyncratic. They were not trajectories of efficiency leading to predetermined destination, nor were they maps of authority or delineation, offering control or explanation. These were routes of discovery, maps of being lost. To be lost is a way to see a place afresh, a way to reimagine a terrain that feels known. To be lost in Kabul is to find it as a place of richness and possibility. Do you want me to go on, or I think this is...
No, I think that's a good spot. So, you know, for the audience who hasn't read the book, I mean, I think this is really such a compelling way of approaching not only Kabul but South Asian cities, and maybe even beyond that, actually more than South Asian cities, because as women we walk in the world quite differently than men do. And one of the questions I had for you was that, can you share with us an experience of when you walked in Kabul kind of made conscious of being vulnerable because you are a woman in that space? Because it's not actually one of the things that enters your narrative, right? So for the most part, you are walking with friends, you are encountering, in a way, you're taken into contexts quite deeply, but because you have access through Afghanis who you are friendly with. But was there ever an experience where you were conscious of being kind of alone in the city in the way you might have felt in Aligarh?
I think
Vulnerable.
that's a really good question, and I think I would go to the difference in the idea of risk in both places. Of course, it's a very different quality of risk that a woman walking in Aligarh faces than any woman walking in Kabul. And I think it's also interesting for me to see how do I walk through Aligarh now, or how do I walk through the world now? It's just a concept that I found has resonated with women almost everywhere I've spoken to about this. This passage I haven't yet had a woman say, I didn't connect to this, because I feel, and again, the book Why Loiter, I think, establishes this really, really wonderfully, which is about how women are not supposed to be just loitering around the city. Like, that you have to have a reason for occupying public space. In Kabul, because I would be with friends or I would be with people who would help me, navigate my space, I felt differently than I did in Aligarh, which is a more familiar space to me. But also because it's so familiar, it's almost like everyone knows you. So you're never, which again I've written about, you're never really anonymous in Aligarh. So like if I was going to the PCO, if someone goes to the PCO and you're just making long distance phone calls in the time when there were PCOs, and if you sort of made phone calls too frequently, then immediately the news would go home, like, oh, your daughter keeps calling up this number in Delhi, is everything okay? So there was this, and I found that would also happen in Kabul. Like a friend, he lit a cigarette in Kabul in a cultural compound, and we'd gone to see a performance or something. And within minutes, he got a call from his father in Europe saying, "Are you smoking?" And I just felt this moment of great connection to him. Then I was like, "Oh my God, this is the same." There was that sense of real. I totally feel your pain at that moment. But in Kabul, I think the thing I remember the most clearly in terms of risk is how quickly things would change. Everything would seem fine, and within minutes, it would be a very difficult situation. And for that, my support system was always the people I was with. They were always there to look out for me, and I trusted them completely. And the sense of following their advice, but also, just simply, listening to them when they told me, how to do things or how not to do things. And I mean, of course, there were transgressions, but I think on the whole, I was a fairly I was very grateful to them for having provided me with this sort of primer to being around the city.
So this idea of like a city that is constantly changing, or that parts of which are disappearing. I mean, it's a very moving rendition that you give us of like a barricade that comes on, gets placed, for instance, and a whole street just disappears, right? And at a level, of course, in a way, cities are always, or parts of cities are always appearing and disappearing. Like I'm thinking of, Delhi, the city I know best in the world, actually. But which I would come back to very frequently, but still with surprise, because every flyover would either reveal or conceal something, with that kind of building going on. And one of the things that's, I think, so wonderful about your book is that you make Kabul exist for us at different times. So you have, of course, a historical Kabul, so the Kabul of Babur, for instance, with those references. But then also the Kabul that for most of us has existed for the last, let's say, 30 years, so the war-torn Kabul. But then also a Kabul that is very much a Kabul of the modern, with buildings that are coming up and high-rises, which I imagine to be sort of like, again, like Delhi, that's that sort of building. And your description of the wedding halls and that whole structure seemed very reminiscent of India once again. So I'm wondering if you could share with the audience maybe a little bit of your revelation of, let's say, the wedding halls, because I think that gives you a really good sense of the kind of coexistence of different levels of time and context in Kabul, So the war-torn, the contemporary, the music, the Bollywood, I mean, all of it, all at the same time. So maybe you could share a little bit of your encounter with that wedding world a little bit, perhaps? How does that sound?
Yeah, Badani, I mean, the way you frame these questions is so interesting to me because, I mean, I've written about them, but, I really feel that it's such a useful way of thinking about this image of a Kabuli wedding hall as something that displays multiple layers of time. And that's exactly what it was. And that's what I've written, that it was in many ways a very emblematic creation of that time in Kabul, which was the time between 2001, let's say, to 2014, which was a time when a section of the city found prosperity, when many people actually were able to build homes after living for decades as refugees abroad. And there was this influx of money into Kabul. Along with that, there were ideas of luxury, and weddings, South Asia, of course, they're big. But the idea of a hall wedding, as opposed to a wedding at home, it wasn't new. It had existed even before through the 70s, and it was a status symbol to get married in a wedding hall. It was certainly a status symbol, and I found of course, there was one layer of it, which was just the visual splendor of these wedding halls. They were massive. They had very opulent decorations. There was one which had a miniature Eiffel Tower in front of it, which was one of the first that I had seen, and I found it really fascinating. And within a few years, that had become sort of just okay, and there were other much bigger, much more magnificent structures on the same street. So it had become like just a small part of a larger thing. But I think, and also just the kind of money that was spent in these ceremonies, all of that is really, really interesting. And I think there was a lot written about it journalistically also. But the thing that really drew me was how the transience, like the awareness of the transience of it. And this was what I found really compelling about the wedding I went to, which I described. And it was this, this splendor, this beauty, this celebration. And one of the women who was dancing there was, one of her relatives said, "Oh, your daughter's crying, you should tend to her." And she said, "Well, let her cry. I mean, I can't stop. I'm dancing right now." That was her attitude. And I thought that it was a moment that really made me reflect on how this relationship with time and with relative security was in Kabul. And people were just, I think, to me, it felt like people were just, well, this is what we have right now, and this is what we're going to do. Because the future is so uncertain. The past has been what it's been. This is what we have, and here, this is our life right now. So I thought that was a deeply, deeply, revealing moment, and that was what really drew me to write about the wedding halls, more so than the layer of their really obvious glitter, which I think was kind of like written about a lot, but also in a way which was like, I found it a little difficult to read about, oh my God, these big Afghan weddings. Why not? Why not? Why wouldn't there be big Afghan weddings?
Right, right. In the world that you describe in Kabul, there's a whole world of expats, right? So all the people from NGOs, the aid organizations, and all of them sort of living in their protected areas, yeah. And I'm imagining that with the work that you were doing, that was also an option for you. So if you had wanted to, you could also have been living in a little protected bubble, but you chose not to, right? I mean, you chose to live in a space that was outside. So I'm wondering if like, can you reflect on that a little bit? I mean, like, what drew you not to have the kind of expat bubble around you and to instead want to kind of burrow into the lived and ordinary lives of Afghanis and of the city,
I mean, like I said, I was just lucky from the get-go to be meeting really, really interesting people, and to have an experience of being out, and the more I saw of that, that's what made it interesting for me. I mean, be living in a compound, and there were so many people who lived in compounds who were just so frustrated by being there, and of course there were so many people who wanted to be working in a different way in Kabul and to be experiencing the city in a different way. I feel like I was very lucky to have, once I had that taste, that was all I wanted. So to me, it made no sense to go back to Kabul without being able to have that degree of flexibility. Of course, it got harder over the years, Padmini. Like in 2006, it was relatively easy. I'm saying relatively because even then it was a city that had security problems. But in 2006, it was relatively easy for me to go out and to be walking. And by 2013, which is again a trajectory I've traced in the book, the city itself seemed to have shrunk. There were security barricades. There were entire streets that had vanished behind these blast walls. It was harder and harder for me to be out for no reason. It was, the city had really transformed. So it's not that I'm describing an existence that is static in that sense of freedom,
Right.
of being able to engage with the street. I think, in fact, that was one of the reasons why the idea of walking seemed so pertinent to this book, because again, that was like a personal barometer for me as how was the city changing, how much could I relate to it on foot, and that definitely became harder. But I think and even now, sometimes people ask me, like, would you go back? And I always feel that it would be to a completely different city also, because so many of the people who I was with at that time have left. They've become refugees. They're seeking asylum in different countries. And the way in which I would return is so important. The idea of going to Kabul and not being able to engage with it is a very difficult one for me.
Yeah, what I was thinking was that even as your experience growing up in Aligarh kind of it gave you a sort of sense of wariness or something like that in terms of how you interacted with the city, with public spaces. At the same time, it also gave you the tools for negotiating a city. So I'm imagining that as a South Asian in Kabul, you're also comfortable in a way that perhaps many of those other expats were not. So perhaps you were more kind of comfortable while aware of the discomfort of knowing how to negotiate the city. And so I find that really, it's exciting, because I think the kind of position and strength that you can bring to travel, right? In this case, to Kabul is quite different from what, let's say, a European traveler would bring, I mean, you would blend into the city in a different way. You would know its structures and rhythms differently, however foreign it might be from what you're used to. You know what I'm saying?
It was definitely the idea of a city that felt very familiar and yet strange. I think that's absolutely how I began relating to it. And like you said, I think I was more used to the idea of having restrictions on how I could explore a city than maybe a woman from a different part of the world would have. And I think, again, as I said, that made me open to exploring the city in a variety of ways, which included through the minds of other Kabulis, like, so, if I couldn't go out and I had long evenings indoors and I would just listen to their stories. And that's a form of travel I could embrace because I was familiar with it. I had inhabited interiors quite fully as a young woman, as a child, growing up in Aligarh, even in other parts of my life. And I was familiar with the idea of books being a form of travel, of travel as a way of exploration that leads you through the lives of other people, through mythology, just these beautiful songs and these stories that came forth with these also these legends of like the best ice cream in town, but I won't tell you where you find it, but I'll get it for you. All of that stuff. I lapped it up because, and I think I was let's say I was sort of pre-programmed to listening to those stories because I had done that before, and I could read that as a form of exploration. I think also as a writer, and this was a fairly big realization for me, was that as an Indian woman, I saw things, or let's say I related to things slightly differently. And it was a process for me to see this as an asset rather than a liability. And to recognize that what I was seeing was also valuable, was worth sharing, because Kabul is such densely inscribed terrain, and so much of what we read and know of it has been shaped by Western narratives, a lot of male narratives, although there exist all these narratives like we talked about from India about our region. I wasn't familiar with them. So it was a process to see this, even as a writer, as a journalist, to see this as an asset. And the idea of wandering, I think, was really useful to me in that sense. Because even in real life, I tend to get lost a lot. And I always thought, oh, that's, this is a fault that I have. And if I'm writing a book about walking, I mean, I should know where I'm going. But the idea of not knowing where you're going is so powerful if you embrace it. And because then you don't have to see anything the way you've been told to see it. And then you can go wherever you want. And then what you see is what you see. And I think that was a moment where I felt really free to be able to write the book, and to be able to write the book that I found moving, about what I found moving and valuable and beautiful and difficult in Kabul.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's lovely. The idea of getting lost and then through that being able to explore and discover Kabul. I want you to share, if you can, just a little bit about the section on the jinns. It's one of the most moving sections, I think, in your book. And it's also one that kind of, it brings us very much in the contemporary, or it's very much anchored in the contemporary, and it's the Kabul and Afghanistan that we all know. So could you just share with the audience a little bit about that section? Maybe just tell us what it was about, because people don't know, and then also how you decided, or why you decided to put it in the book.
Yeah, so each of the chapters uses a certain lens to look at the city. For instance, what we've been talking about so far has been, let's say, cinema or books and writing. And one of these lenses was the idea of jinn, which is what, like in so many parts of the world, when mental illness is called being possessed by jinn, different forms of mental illness. And I found the same idea in Kabul, and I found it a useful way to describe my what I found experience with, especially with women who were drug users or who suffered from some form of mental illness, and this whole stigma that went with it, and how and what resources they could use to be able to deal with the situation. It wasn't only about women, of course. It's not exclusively about women, but I think I was really drawn to the stories of women, especially one woman in particular who I met in a community center where people were just sort of given help in terms of dealing with their drug use. And she was expecting, and she had a young child with her, and she shared her story, which I thought was incredibly heartbreaking and so brave, because she was trying very hard to leave the habit. And she said what helped her was the thought of her child who she was expecting, and the child that she'd already had was also addicted to opium. And she said, well, I want this new child to at least be free of this curse. And I thought this is trauma that goes through generations, and it takes different shapes, which is what we think of as jinns as well. You know, they last through generations. They take different shapes. It was a story that felt really familiar, and it was I thought a story that really brought out the kind of phantoms that the people of the city are dealing with. And we hear a lot about the war, and it does seem to be a part of Kabul, but it always seems to be a war of bullets and bombs and ammunition. I think this is another war of drugs and this kind of poverty, kind of helplessness, and the kind of loss of agency. These are tracks of war. These are effects of war. Like Afghanistan is facing the fallout of producing the world's largest crops of opium. And I feel this is also a form of writing about war. It's to see how it transforms civilian lives, to see how it's shaping the lives of children now. I mean, in 2013, a whole new generation is living with these phantoms. So this is how war perpetuates itself, I think. This is why I feel the idea of war correspondence or war reportage needs to become wider to accommodate narratives like this. We always tend to, we're talking about the book as travel narrative, which I think is wonderful, because it is. I think it is part of my agenda, was to talk about travel as in a slightly subversive way. And similarly, I think we can also think about making the idea of war reportage or writing about war more capacious, to be able to, there's a bee trying to get into the frame, to accommodate these kind of events and voices.
Right. Yeah. No, and I would completely agree with you there. I mean, I think as travel narrative too, you've really pushed the boundaries of what travel does, because not only, every travel narrative at some level is giving you kind of history, sociology, politics, background, etc. But you've really pushed the boundary, because you're not giving us just an exploration of a place in terms of inviting people to travel in as a tourist, so to speak, right? It's a very different kind of an exploration and integration that you're inviting us to do through this travel narrative. So I really deeply appreciated that. Preeti, is this about the time when we open it up to questions, or what should we do? Yeah?
Yeah, we can, we still have 4 or 5 minutes. We can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, take another 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay. So
If
then
you understood the signal.
Yes, I did. Yes. So, so actually what I would like to turn to then, Taran, is where you started, which is, this strange formulation that you offer as a kind of Afghani alternate to Once Upon a Time. And I've been puzzling about it since I read this, because even though I feel, and I'm trying to find the exact words, I feel like it works really well for the way in which you approach Kabul. So there was one, there was no one, right? Because so much of your book is about these veils, what's behind the veil and what gets revealed at different times. So I think it's a very compelling way of understanding Kabul and maybe cities more broadly. But I feel a little puzzled about it as a way of fairy tale telling or once upon a time framing. And I guess what I'm wondering is, like that once upon a time locates us in a way at a time that you can't place, right? That's why it's once upon a time. So it becomes a kind of a model entry point for a kind of story. So if this is the Afghani way, then what is an Afghani story? What does it tell us about Afghanistanis that their way of approaching narrative is to say there was one, there was no one?
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
really, really difficult question, Padmini. But I think it's not only Afghans. I think it's. I know in Iran, possibly in Central Asia, also this is the convention. It's really common. Like you just start every story with Yaki Bud, Yaki Nabud. And I found myself drawn to it. I think because it did so much of the work for me in terms of, as you say, establishing the illusory nature of cities. Because every city, like you and I could live in the same city and not share the city at all, which is the experience. Living in Mumbai, I know it's so common that people live in physical proximity to each other and inhabit completely different cities, different Mumbais, and similarly with so many other places. And I think that's what I thought. I thought the phrase did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of establishing this frame for me. It's not specific to Afghanistan, but it is. I think in my telling, I think it was useful also because we think of Kabul as a city we can never imagine. It's a place completely, and because we can never imagine it, what the things that go on there, the atrocities, the pain. I think it's a way of anesthetizing ourselves to the difficulties. Because if it's a city like the one you and I live in, then what's going on there is really disturbing, So I wanted to bring it within, to frame it as a place of the imagination, but also as a place which is versions of cities that all of us know. And in that way, to bridge that, what is it like there? I wanted to bridge that distance when people would say, well, what is it like there? The gap between them and the theirsness. I wanted to bridge that by using this phrase. I think your question is a really deep one, but I hope this gives you some sense of why I was drawn to this idea of starting the book with this phrase.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll have to go poking into, other kinds of literatures to understand it better. But thank you very much for that. Yeah. So now, shall we?
So,
Yeah,
Padmini,
please.
would you be taking
I think
questions?
there are some questions in the chat. Padmini, if you look at them and sift through them, because there's some 2 or 3 about women. The lives of women of different social standing, how safe or unsafe do the local people feel? Are local women allowed to move out of their homes freely?
Should we start there with the question about women?
Yeah.
Someone was asking about the bird. Is that your pet bird? No, it's not my pet. It's just a bird, a wild bird, but it wanted to be heard as part of the event. Yeah, sure. So, to begin with, I want to say that I am not an Afghanistan expert. Of course, I'll answer the questions as best as I can based on my experience. But what often happens is that very sort of general questions are hard for me to address because they're general and I can speak from my experience. So please do remember that whatever I share will be through the lens of my own experience and what I saw and what I had the opportunity to relate to. What is the question, Padmini? Could you please share that?
You know how safe or unsafe women in Afghanistan feel? What can you share about their ordinary lives and how they move around the city?
So again, Afghanistan is a big country. I can talk about Kabul. And what I will say is that when I was there, women were a large part of the workforce. And obviously, depending on social class, everyone had different ways of getting around the city. Everyone had different parts of the city that they would go to. It changed, there were very, very, very expensive restaurants. It's a wartime economy. So there were places where you could go blow up a couple of $100 over dinner. And there were also chaikhanas, there were smaller sort of, roadside eating joints. So it really depended on who you were with, where you were going, the part of town you were in. Of course, every part of the city had a different character, which again, I've written about a little bit in the sense that there were the really, the prosperous, the really sort of, what is the word, the very hip hangout joints in Charonor, as opposed to the more residential areas. So I think it's a different city for every woman, but definitely there were, and again, this has changed since I've come back, but a lot of offices provided pickups and drops for their employees, men or women. It depended on who you were, what work you were doing, the distance you had to commute as well. I think one thing I should say is that the reason I was told not to walk was not because I'm a woman, but because I have come from abroad. So it's not that I was told that as a woman I should stay home in Kabul. I was told that as a foreigner. I related to that differently because I'm a woman. That landed differently for me because I had this complicated relationship with walking and from being from South Asia. But as in the sense of risk, my husband was also told the same.
So, a related question, Taran, is were local women jealous of you because you had more freedom? And then did you walk around covered with a chadar, and did you always walk around with men, or did you walk around, I think people want to know a little more about how you actually walked around.
Okay. I don't think anyone was jealous of me. They were all really, really generous and really wonderful. Just opened up so many routes for me. And like I said, like there's all kinds of ways. I think maybe we all do this to an extent when we have people visiting us from abroad. As Indians, we want to show them our cities, right? Like we want to show them what's special about our homes, our environment. It doesn't matter where you live. When you have a visitor or someone who comes from somewhere else, you want to show them what makes the place special to you. And I think that's what I was really fortunate enough to get. And because every person inhabits a different city, I was able to see so many aspects of Kabul because of them. I didn't wear a chadar. I would cover my head, which was a convention at the time. Besides that, I would wear pretty much the same things that I wore in my daily life in India. I will say that women in Kabul were far better dressed than me. They had this wonderful sense of fashion. There was a sort of chic, everyday, even the everyday garments were so chic, and they had this nice, like there was always something really wonderful about it, like a small touch to it, I saw this woman crossing the street, and it was a really gray day, and it was so muddy, and I was just like, I felt like, oh, what a terrible day to, it was just really overcast. And she was wearing really nice boots and a red scarf, and she just stood out like a splash of color in the middle of the street. So, and I remember, my colleagues would always come wearing really simple, but there would always be this touch of elegance. And when I would say, oh, your tunic is so beautiful, or your scarf is so beautiful, they had the loveliest response, which was, Chashmishama Maqbool, your eyes are beautiful. The value is in how you see it. It's not in the thing itself. I think I always remember that because if someone tells me, oh, I love your top, I say, oh yeah, really, I got it at a sale. You just tend to sort of brush it aside. Many of us are not good at taking compliments like that. But the idea of saying that your eyes are beautiful, you are the person giving beauty to this article, I think was really something I've always remembered from that time. So there was all this depth to our interaction, is what I'm trying to say, I suppose.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat, which is about views on the impending change of power in Afghanistan with the US withdrawal and then the withdrawal of the supporting forces. So your views on that, but also I see two hands up. So Bani has her hand up and Rakhi, and I don't quite know how we go about asking them to ask their questions. So while somebody does that, maybe you can answer this one that's in the chat.
I've requested Bani to please unmute yourself, and she's already unmuted. I'm requesting Rakhi also. So Bani, you can raise your question.
But first, let Taran answer
the first question. Yeah, after that, yeah. Let this first question.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I'm offering this as someone who hasn't been to Kabul since 2013. And I think it's really important now to listen to Afghans who are in Afghanistan and to hear their voices on this question. My only sort of, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen after September 11th, which is the date, I think, for the withdrawal. But it's been, I can only say that this is the generation that has been incredibly committed to the idea of social change and democracy and peace. I think I would really put my whatever hope there is in the idea of Afghans, finding peace for themselves, and especially this generation, which has really taken. I mean, in 2001, there were so many people who were young. They'd grown up in Iran or Pakistan. Many of the people who I had the good fortune to work with or to associate with were young filmmakers, and they had never seen Kabul, but they'd always thought of it as home. And when they came back, they related to it by making films, and they made films under the most difficult conditions, and they were really beautiful. It was really beautiful work, especially because it was done in such difficult circumstances. And as time went by, many of them felt they had no future in Afghanistan, and they left. I felt, I feel that was a real loss, and I feel that's the generation, those who have stayed behind. Of course, there are many who are there, who are working so hard. There was an attack on Kabul University recently that was absolutely heartbreaking to see, because it was all young men and women who were the flower of this generation. And I think there's a reason why they are targeted. It's because that is where the hope is. So I would really look, that would be really where I put my sights.
So Bani, I think maybe you asked your question now.
Right. Thanks both Taran and Padmini. I really enjoyed that conversation, and it sounds like a fantastic book. So I really have to get my hands on it. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about this idea of walking. And I think walking in a city is such a powerful kind of way to claim space. And you made reference to Shilpa Phatke's work on Why Loiter. Mohammad Junaid has this entire, writes a lot about walking as an act of resistance in Kashmir amidst, surveillance policies and so on. And in that, I was wondering that, so it's kind of like to walk in someone's shoes is how you experience life and so on. And you really kind of highlighted how walking entails a lot of labor in how you kind of understand the city. And then I was wondering if you can invert that question to ask that, what is walking like for different people? So what is walking like for the expats? What is walking like for the locals? What is walking like for you? You kind of say that for you, walking was a way of almost travel, in a way of getting to know the city. And I was wondering if that is different from walking in everyday life, and what that kind of juxtaposition might mean for people. And then I was wondering that, are there any kinds of, in Pakistan, for instance, you'll have this movement of girls at dhabas, which is kind of an act of claiming public space, and whether there were like similar initiatives in Kabul in that way. And I really like this idea of how like getting lost in a city is a fantastic way to kind of explore the city. But just to kind of be a devil's advocate over here, to get lost also means that a sense of safety in being found again. And I was wondering if there is, what does this idea of getting lost in that space mean? Thanks then.
Okay, so yeah, that's about 7 questions in one, Bunny, but I'll do my best. I agree with you that walking means different things to different people, and it totally depends on where you are, of course. And I think for me, it took a while to arrive at the idea of walking as a narrative device for this book, because I had that experience in my own life with walking and all that it meant to me. And I agree with you that it's just something so personal. Like for me, it was a quality of intimacy, and it was also, I think, the readiness to relate to the city. Because when you put your body out into the street, you're a part of the city. And I think that's an important gesture to make. It's an act of affiliation in a way. It's a taking of sides. I'm here, and I think that's a wonderful way to begin being in a city, is to inhabit it, is to feel the earth under your feet. Very basic. There are other cities in the world where American suburbia, you don't really walk much. Everyone has a car, and or a place like Dubai, it would be hard to walk, maybe because of the weather, or I haven't spent that much time in Dubai, but when I was there, it was clearly walking was not a usual option. But I think in Kabul, for me, it was a way of establishing a relationship with Kabul. It was a way of establishing a relationship with everything that I was seeing, and also a road into writing about it. That was, I think, offered me this path to being able to move through the city, not only physically, but conceptually, through metaphor, through mythology, through memory, by coming back to Aligarh, by going to my grandfather's memory. This was a route, I think, that was very rich. And I think it's also important to recognize that many walks are essentially there are many ways of walking and exploring the city. I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of the last part of your question. No, if Padmini, if you remember.
I asked way too many questions, so
No,
I want to
that's
give somebody else the
fine.
chance.
Sorry, I
But thank
didn't
you for
see
that. Thanks.
So iPhone Rakhi, I don't know where.
Yes, I'm here. Thank
Hi.
you. Yeah, I'm just on audio, so forgive me for that. But thank you so much, Taran Khan, for that lovely account. It's indeed so fascinating. Whatever I heard, of course, we haven't read your book, and I'm surely going to get my copy. And that wonderful engagement by Padmini Mongia, I think, has brought the book alive to us. But I'll just pick up where Bani's left off, is that, you had this very intimate account of the city. You walked in it, the everyday, the quotidian. You were part of it. There are collective memories. You have your parental, your ancestral relationship, which is all part of that, writing the architecture of writing in your head. And at the same time, your lived experience as you move in it, and which probably generated much of the rhetoric that I can understand as you give your account. But I'm also curious, Taran, I'm also curious if, this particular state of mind and this experience of traveling in the everyday, lived as someone who's been there, who goes and comes back, was there also the element of the flaneur, somebody who's walking in the city as a voyeur, someone who's probably also looking at the city from the outside? Because we have been talking about the intimacy of your experience, but I'm also wondering if alongside this intimate travel, this intimate kind of everyday living that you did there, was there also the voyeur, the flaneur, who was looking from outside? And did these two come together in some ways to make your, to make your narrative more self-reflexive, in the manner that you've been able to pick up little things as an observer and also participate in so many things as somebody who's lived through them?
That's a great question. Thank you, Rakhi, right?
Yes, Rakhi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a really, really interesting question. And I mean, I have a difficult relationship with the idea of flaneur, of flaneuse, if you want. I mean, if that's the term we use for a woman, flaneur.
Yes.
But
yes.
Certainly, I think the idea of the outsider, the insider-outsider gaze is one that I foregrounded for the reason that I feel as a journalist, as someone, and again, as a reader, just to go back a step, when writers erase themselves, especially from non-fiction books, I feel a sense of discomfort just as a reader. And for that reason, I felt it was important for me to insert myself into the narrative, because I wanted readers to be very clear about who the person was who was telling them these stories. And which is also why I was comfortable, using my time in Aligarh or my experiences as a woman in India, and also my time in Kabul, of course, essentially that's why I put myself on the page, not because this was memoir, and this was a track that came up quite often when I began writing the book, was that, well, is this memoir? Should it be straight up in publishing? It would be easier if it was a memoir. But I felt that that's the story we've read and heard a fair few times of a journalist in a war zone. So I wasn't interested in that track, but I was very invested in ensuring that the readers knew who the guide was, who they were following, and definitely like the sense of connection, and also the idea of my being someone from the outside, connecting to the city in my particular way, through my particular baggage, through my relationships. You know, this is the web that forms. I think this is how we relate to cities anywhere, right? Like this is what I've written also. Like, it's the city that we know, that we cast into every city that we go to, that we explore. There are versions of that, which is also what beautiful reflection in Invisible Cities by
Yes, by Calvino.
yeah, exactly. You know, so Marco Polo is describing Venice. Every city he describes as Venice, which is a city he knows and loves. That's such a powerful idea, you know. So I feel journalistically it's important for me to clarify who I am, and for the reader to know who I am. As a storyteller, I think it's an important device. And just as an explorer of cities, I think it's really important to know that this is the perspective through which you're seeing the city.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yes, Padmini.
No, just going to invite other questions if there were others. Preeti, did we get all the ones in the chat?
I think so.
I mean, you asked a question about
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was basically about, you know, how do they even retain any of their you know, sense of being a people, because there's so much displacement. There've been conflict after conflict, and, you know, so much displacement because Afghans have just had to move all over the world. So how does that happen? What sustains them, and how do they sort of cohese as a, you know, just as being Afghani, having that culture?
Yeah, that's a really important point, CPG, I think, because the idea of Kabul existing outside Kabul was something I found quite frequently, in the sense that, you know, if I visited, say, people who had moved to Europe in the 70s, which was the early years of the conflict, and obviously, you know, these would be families who had more, who were wealthier, or who had more of the means to leave at that time, and you know, their homes would be perfectly preserved enclaves of Kabul from that time. There would be the songs of Ahmad Zahir. There would be the kind of food that was common in their homes at that time. And I think it's important to recognize, I mean, this is the I think it's the largest diaspora under protracted care of the UNHCR. You know, maybe it's not the largest refugee community in the world anymore. Maybe it's the second largest, but over the years, this is a diaspora that's been formed over decades. And again, the first chapter of my book and the last chapter of my book are called Return. Because by the end, as I said, in 2013, many people who had arrived after 2001 thinking to settle down were thinking of leaving again. And they had this sort of half presence in Kabul. So I think it's a cycle. I mean, I don't know how they do it. I don't know what their thought is. I don't know what goes on in their minds and hearts in terms of handling this. But I know that, you know, if you look at the idea of Afghan culture, you will have to look outside of Afghanistan as well.
Mm. And this, you know, the songs that play throughout in the taxi that, you know, you take occasionally when you're in the taxi, and then there's this Ahmad Zahir.
Yeah. I
mean, I had to look it up and listen to him because he seemed like such an overwhelming presence. You know, he's there in every. So that's what I mean by despite the displacement, there is obviously a cohesive culture. There is something that binds you together, and there's the song and the poetry and the, this whole thing of being Afghan. So, and through his songs, I don't know that, like, whatever I heard, I didn't understand very much, but it certainly catches you.
I think he sung a few his songs in Urdu and Hindi as well.
Yeah, yeah. So if we don't have questions, then should we move forward and ask Dr. Guruptesh to please do our thank yous?
Yeah, I'm just requesting Guru Dev Singh, sir. Please unmute yourself, sir. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. I think I don't have to thank you because the kinds of probing questions that you got, I think that tells how interested all of our audience was with your talk. But I have a personal kind of thing. When I was reading the first or 2 pages of the book, which were freely available on the Google, I thought the person who has walked the streets of Kabul must be some mature, daring person. And here I find a young, pretty girl who has been able to do this. And I think you deserve a special word of thanks and congratulations for taking up such a daring work. The only thing that I discovered during your talk is that you've been wearing so many glasses when you were walking the streets of Kabul. Sometimes you were a journalist, sometimes you were kind of a personal explorer who had connections with Kabul. Sometimes you are a political observer or a social observer. And when you were talking about drug addiction, honestly, I was reminded of the old Kabliwala that we are most familiar with, Tagore's story, if you remember, Kabliwala. That Kabliwala is a very different person from the kind of drug addicts that you're talking about today. And I think it's a very tragic part of the story that so many people in Kabul are now down with this kind of drug addiction. But anyway, I think you have given us a wonderful kind of a sneak preview of the city, and you have tempted us to go back to the book and probably to the city also. And I think a lot of political questions also get resolved with the kind of reading that we will get from your book. I'm particularly grateful to Padmini because she has been able to ask some very probing questions and made the entire talk so lucid and so very interesting for the audience. Padmini, we probably, I'm a teacher of English, so we know you because you have done this book on post-colonial theory. And we've been using some of it, some of the essays for our classes. And it's nice to see you and meet you in person, of course, on the Zoom, but it was a great opportunity. Thank you very much for running this session. I think Taran Khan, you deserve a special word of 3 cheers, and in fact, not a word of
Thank you.
because you have been such a kind of wonderful explorer. And hopefully, I think one of these days when we get hold of the book, we'll go through it and discover more about it as we walk along with you. Walking has been wonderful way of, I have been a great admirer of Bryson. I have been reading a lot of Bryson, and he's a great travel writer. And I think he has been walking a lot around the world. And I'll see that if your book also kind of, takes us along all those streets of Kabul. Thank you very much. I think, thank you on behalf of Maja House. I think thank you particularly to the organizers, Preeti Gill and Arvind Chamak. I think they have been able to curate this talk very well. And I think our audience is greatly benefited. Thank you once again for making this session so wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you once again. Thank you, Taran. Thank you, Padmini. And thank you, audience.
Ravinderji, tell them about the next session, please. Don't let the opportunity go by.
Yeah, we have a next session that is on 19th, the next Saturday. It's going to be under the Akhir program with in collaboration with Prabha Khaitan Foundation, where we're having a session with Gurmeet Kadyalvi, such a noted novelist and writer of Punjabi literature. And in conversation with Gurmeet Kadyalvi would be Nirupama Dutt, a very senior journalist from India and part of Maja House. So we'll be sharing the Zoom link with all of you guys. Should you be interested, you can drop in your mail. We have already sent the link for that mail for the invites, and do join us. And on the 26th, we have another session on the memoirs. It'll be, it's a month of good literary programs. And today, honestly, Taran, it was indeed a wonderful session. Thank you so very much for joining us from Aligarh, and thank you, Padmini, from Pennsylvania. And thank you, Maja House, for such a blessing. Qasim has joined us late. He has just texted, and since he was busy at the FAS Foundation meeting. Thank you so very much, Dr. Gurupdesh, and thank you, Taran.
My pleasure. Thank you to everyone.
Hope to see you soon at Amritsar.
I hope so too. And just to add, if anyone is planning to buy the book, of course, get it from Amazon if it's easier. But if you can, please buy it from an independent bookshop.
Sure.
Yeah, but they're not open yet. No, mostly.
Yeah.
Still. And Amritsar is very sad because we have just one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, ordering.
I hope if you get it, I hope you enjoy the story. Thank you very much to everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night and good day to you, Padmini.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.